I remember the night everything shattered with a clarity that still makes my chest tighten. The fluorescent lights of the hospital hallway hummed above me, sterile and unkind, as I sat slumped on a hard plastic chair. My chest still ached from the collapse earlier that evening, a warning from my body that years of labor, sacrifice, and silent endurance had finally taken their toll. I should have been surrounded by comfort, by family leaning close with worry in their eyes. Instead, my son-in-law bent down, his breath warm against my ear, and whispered words that cut deeper than any illness ever could. "You're becoming a useless burden," he said, his tone flat, almost casual, as if he were discussing the weather. For a moment, I thought I'd misheard. The words floated in the sterile air, circling me like vultures waiting to descend. But when I looked at him, his eyes were cold, and the truth struck me harder than the chest pain had. He meant it. I closed my eyes, replaying the years I had given everything, my time, my health, my pride, to build a life not for myself, but for my daughter and her husband. The house, the savings, the endless nights I spent working when my body screamed for rest. And here I was, discarded like an old coat, too frayed to be of use. The stakes pressed in around me, suffocating. My dignity, my role as a father, even my place in the home I had built. Everything teetered on the edge of being taken from me. And I was too weak, too tired, to stand tall against the storm. Then came the rustle of paper. A folder was slid into my lap by the very hands that had once shaken mine with promises of loyalty and care. Legal documents, neat lines of text blurring before my weary eyes. My son-in-law's voice was deceptively soft. "This is for your own good," he said, tapping where my signature was meant to go. "It'll make things easier. No complications." I knew what it meant without needing to read every word. Signing those papers meant handing over the house, the last anchor of my independence. It meant surrendering not just bricks and mortar, but the years of sweat, the echoes of laughter, the memories etched into the walls. My life's work reduced to a transaction in the quiet cruelty of a hospital corridor. Inside me, a war raged. Part of me wanted to give in, to end the conflict before it swallowed me whole. My daughter stood nearby, silent, her eyes fixed on the floor. Did she agree with him? Was she ashamed of me too? The questions burned hotter than the pain in my chest. But another part of me, the part that remembered holding her tiny hand as she took her first steps, or working 2 jobs so she could have an education, refused to let go so easily. I was trembling, my heart pounding against weakened ribs, but my soul screamed, "Not yet." My fingers hovered over the pen. The silence was unbearable, filled with their expectations, their certainty that I would surrender. My breath caught, my hand shook, but I set the pen down. "No," I whispered, my voice hoarse but firm. The word hung in the air like a thunderclap. My son-in-law's face tightened, his polite mask slipping into something darker. My daughter still would not meet my gaze, and in that moment I understood the depth of my betrayal, not just from the man who married my daughter, but from the silence of the daughter I had raised. I sat there, heart aching, eyes stinging, staring at the signature line I refused to cross. And as the night deepened around us, one truth settled heavy in my chest. The battle for my dignity had just begun. Suspense lingered like a shadow as they gathered the papers, wordless. Their silence promised storms ahead. When I left the hospital, I thought at least my own home would be a refuge. The night air was sharp, stinging my lungs as I made my way back through streets I had walked for decades. Every corner held a memory, my daughter's laughter as a child, the evenings I dragged myself home after double shifts, the holidays when the windows glowed with warmth. I told myself, whatever happens, at least those walls are still mine. But when I reached the gate, something was wrong. The porch light flickered faintly, but the door looked unfamiliar. I tried my key, pressing it into the lock with shaking hands, but it wouldn't turn. At first, I thought it was the fatigue, the hospital drugs still clouding my mind. I tried again, harder this time, until my hand ached. The lock resisted me, and then it struck me. The locks had been changed. The realization hit harder than the hospital collapse. I rattled the handle, disbelief turning to panic. The home I had built with my bare hands, brick by brick, paycheck by paycheck, had shut me out like a stranger. I rang the bell. Footsteps echoed inside, deliberate, unhurried. My son appeared behind the glass pane, his figure distorted by the frosted glass. For a moment, hope flickered. Surely he'd open the door, smile awkwardly, explain it was a mistake. But when the door creaked open, his face held no warmth. "It's for the best, Dad," he said. His words were rehearsed, too clean, as if he had practiced them in front of a mirror. Behind him, I saw boxes stacked neatly in the hallway. My boxes. My clothes, my books, my tools, all packed away, sealed, labeled, as though I had already been erased from my own life. I couldn't breathe. "For the best?" I repeated, my voice trembling. "For whose best?" He wouldn't meet my eyes. His wife's shadow lingered at the edge of the living room, watching but not speaking. I felt like an intruder, a ghost haunting the house I had built. The betrayal was not just hers, it was his. My own blood, siding against me, cutting me off like I was nothing more than an inconvenience. Memories rushed in, cruel in their clarity. The nights I skipped meals so there would be enough for them. The years of sweat and exhaustion to keep the roof secure over their heads. The promises I whispered to my late wife, swearing I would protect our children no matter what. And now my son stood before me, cold-eyed, telling me it was for the best. Shame curled in my chest, hot and suffocating. Was I such a burden now that even love could not excuse me? Was my worth measured only by the strength of my back and the money in my pocket? "Dad," he said softly, as if gentleness could soften cruelty, "you'll understand one day. This way, things will be simpler, simpler." The word felt like acid. They had planned this, changed the locks, packed my things, rehearsed their explanations. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a moment of weakness. It was a decision, a choice to cast me aside. I wanted to shout, to demand answers, to remind him of who I was and everything I had given. But the words caught in my throat. My heart pounded, my breath fogged in the cold night air. And then, with an awkward finality, he placed a single suitcase on the porch. "This should be enough for now," he muttered, and shut the door. The click of the lock echoed in my ears like a gavel, final and merciless. I stood there in the falling snow, clutching that suitcase as if it held not just clothes but the last shreds of my dignity. The house, my house, was no longer mine. I was a stranger on the street, staring at windows that once glowed with my family's warmth. The snow fell heavier, coating my shoulders, numbing my hands. Around me, the world was silent except for the faint hum of life inside those walls from which I had been exiled. I turned away, each step heavier than the last, carrying not just a suitcase but the unbearable weight of betrayal. And in that frozen night, one truth wrapped itself around me like the bitter wind. I had nowhere to go. The winter that followed was not measured in days but in nights. Long, merciless nights when the cold crept into my bones and refused to let go. I learned quickly that the city had no memory, no mercy. A man could build a life, a home, a family, and still, the very next day, be reduced to wandering the streets, invisible to the very people he once passed proudly with his head high. I walked until my feet blistered, until the rhythm of my steps was the only thing that reminded me I was still alive. The benches in Bryant Park became my bed, their iron bars biting into my back as I tried to find rest beneath layers of newspapers I pulled from trash bins. I wrapped them around my legs, listening to the wind tear through the bare trees, and told myself stories in the dark, stories of better times. When my son was small and would crawl into my lap to escape his nightmares, now I was the one drowning in nightmares. And there was no lap to climb into. Hunger gnawed at me like an unrelenting animal. The first days I resisted, too proud to line up at soup kitchens, too ashamed to be seen by eyes that might recognize me. But pride is a weak companion in the face of a growling stomach. Eventually I joined the lines of the discarded, the men with hollow faces, women clutching children with eyes too old for their years. We shuffled forward, heads bowed, as if surrendering not just to hunger, but to the humiliation that clung to us like a second skin. The food was simple, a ladle of soup, a piece of bread, sometimes an apple. But to me, each bowl felt like both a mercy and a wound. I had once been the man providing meals, carving the meat, serving laughter with the wine. Now I was reduced to extending my hand like a beggar, praying for warmth in both body and spirit, and always, the shame. It burned hotter than the cold ever could. Every time I bent my head over a steaming cup of broth, I saw my son's face, his little boy smile, his teenage scowl, his grown man's cold eyes the night he shut me out. I wondered what he told himself now, whether he pictured me somewhere safe, cared for, tucked away in dignity. Would he sleep peacefully knowing the truth? That his father, the man who raised him, now lived like a ghost on the streets? The city taught me new lessons each night. How to keep moving so frostbite wouldn't claim my toes. How to duck into subway stations for a brief wash of heat before the guards pushed us back out. How to use plastic bags under my coat to trap warmth. How to keep one eye open even as exhaustion pulled me under. Survival became a science, one I never thought I'd have to learn at my age. Yet, even as the snow fell and the nights stretched into months, a small ember of endurance smoldered within me. Something deep inside refused to be extinguished. Perhaps it was my late wife's voice, whispering that I was more than what they had reduced me to. Perhaps it was pure stubbornness. Whatever it was, it kept me alive. One evening, after a day of wandering aimlessly with an empty stomach, I found myself outside a church. Light spilled from its doors golden against the snow. A line had already formed, men and women waiting patiently, the smell of soup drifting out to meet us. My pride resisted again, but my hunger dragged me forward. Inside, the hall was warm and alive with the clatter of trays and the hum of voices. Volunteers ladled soup with practiced hands, smiles painted carefully onto faces that pitied but did not understand. I took my bowl, grateful and humiliated all at once, and found a corner to eat quietly. That's when I noticed him, a man behind the counter, not like the others. His eyes lingered on me longer than they should have, studying, searching. Something in his gaze made me shift uneasily. When the line thinned and the hall began to quiet, he stepped out from behind the counter. He walked toward me with measured steps, his expression unreadable. Then, in a voice low but certain, he said, "I know your name." I froze, spoon halfway to my lips. The words cut through the haze of shame and hunger like a blade. "We need to talk," he added. The spoon slipped from my trembling hand, clattering against the bowl. In that instant, the room seemed to shrink. The faces blur, the air thicken. Someone knew me. Someone still remembered who I was. And the way he said it, firm, deliberate, told me this was not charity. This was something else entirely. He sat across from me in that crowded church hall, the smell of broth still clinging to the air, his coat folded neatly over his arm. He did not look like a man who belonged among the soup lines, and that made me uneasy. His voice, calm yet insistent, seemed to cut through the noise as he repeated, "I know your name." For a moment I thought he must be mistaken. Surely no one here in this dim hall filled with the forgotten would recognize me. But then he leaned closer and said my full name, not just the first, but the surname too, rolling it with precision as if he had spoken it many times before. It was like being yanked back from the abyss. My name, my true name, the one tied to deeds and sacrifices, to the sweat of my youth poured into bricks and beams. The name that my own son had erased when he locked the door against me. Hearing it spoken aloud made my chest ache as if something buried deep had been disturbed. "Who are you?" I whispered, ashamed at how weak my voice sounded. He smiled faintly, though his eyes held no amusement. "A lawyer," he said. "I once worked on some documents related to your house." At the word house, my pulse stuttered. My house, the one I had built brick by brick, paycheck by paycheck. The one where I had carried my wife over the threshold, where my son had taken his first steps. The one where my daughter-in-law had whispered venom in my ear, calling me useless, before they showed me the papers they wanted signed. The house that was no longer mine. I clenched my fists, my shame boiling again. "There is no house," I muttered. "It's gone. Signed away," but the lawyer shook his head. "Not everything. Not yet." His words dropped like stones into a still pond, sending ripples of disbelief through me. For weeks I had convinced myself there was nothing left, that my legacy had been stolen in one swift act of betrayal. To hear otherwise felt dangerous, like being offered a glass of water in the desert, only to fear it was a mirage. I stared at him, my breath shallow. "What do you mean?" He leaned closer, lowering his voice as if the walls themselves might be listening. "I handled some of the early drafts. Your son-in-law is clever but careless. He pushed through changes that were never fully executed. There are clauses, protections, things he assumed you'd never understand. But the truth is, they don't own everything. Not yet." The words should have lit me with hope, but instead I felt fear. Fear of believing again, of letting that faint ember inside me grow only to see it crushed beneath another boot. I had learned on the streets that hope was a dangerous luxury. It could carry you for a day, maybe two, but when it shattered, it left you colder than the snow ever could. I searched his face for deceit, for pity, for some hidden agenda. But all I found was steady conviction. He spoke like a man who had spent his life parsing through fine print, catching what others missed. "And why tell me this?" I asked finally, my voice shaking. He didn't flinch. "Because I've seen men like you destroyed by silence. Because I know the law, and I know when it's been twisted. And because—" He paused, his eyes narrowing. "I don't like bullies who think age makes a man disposable." I wanted to laugh, to weep, to run. Instead, I lowered my gaze to my trembling hands. Could it be true? Was there still a thread of dignity, of ownership that they hadn't managed to cut? The hall around us emptied slowly, the clatter of trays fading. My soup had gone cold, untouched, yet I hadn't moved. I was frozen between disbelief and longing, between the ashes of betrayal and the fragile possibility of justice. Finally, he placed a card on the table. His name, embossed in clean letters, seemed almost unreal in my roughened, dirt-streaked hands. "They think they own everything," he said softly, his voice steady as stone. "But they don't. Come see me tomorrow." I lifted my eyes to meet his. For the first time in months, I saw not pity but recognition. Someone was telling me I wasn't finished yet. I tucked the card into my pocket, as if it were a match I dared not light just yet. But all the same, it burned there, a secret flame against the winter night. I remember the first night I walked into the small rented room the lawyer had helped me secure. The air smelled faintly of damp wood. The single window rattled with the evening wind, and the mattress sagged in the middle like a tired back. Yet to me it was a kingdom, because it was mine. For the first time in months, I closed a door behind me that no one else had the right to open. By day, I worked in a repair shop, my hands blackened with grease and the smell of metal clinging to my clothes. I was no craftsman, but I learned quickly, driven by necessity. Each tool I fixed was a small victory. Each wage slip, though modest, was proof that I had not been erased. My dignity came back in fragile pieces. Like shards of glass, I was slowly learning to reassemble. The hardest part was silence. Not once did my family call. Not once did they ask where I was or how I survived. The truth burned more than hunger ever had. Blood had betrayed me. Yet strangers, the lawyer, the shop owner, extended the kindness my own kin had withheld. Still, at night, when exhaustion wrapped itself around me like a heavy blanket, I found myself whispering questions into the dark. Why had I been abandoned so easily? Did my daughter truly believe I deserved this exile? Hope and grief battled within me, and some nights grief won. Then came the rumor. A customer at the shop mentioned it casually, almost carelessly. My son-in-law's business was crumbling. Debts, creditors circling like vultures, contracts lost. My heart stuttered in my chest. The man who had stolen everything from me was now standing on quicksand. I walked home that evening with the echo of those words rattling in my mind. For the first time in a long while, the balance of power seemed to shift. The empire built on my ruin was beginning to crack, and I couldn't help but wonder, was this collapse fate's hand? Or an opening meant for me to step through? It was past midnight when the knock came. A sharp, uneven rapping against the thin wood of my rented door. My heart jolted. Few people even knew where I lived. I pulled the latch with trembling fingers, and there he was, my son. His face was ghostly pale, his eyes hollow, as if sleep and hope had abandoned him both. "Baba," he whispered, and for a moment I almost forgot everything. Almost reached out like I once did when he was a boy. But the years of silence and betrayal pressed heavily on my chest. He stepped inside, pacing the cramped room, wringing his hands. Finally the words tumbled out. He needed money. Business was collapsing, creditors were circling, and he said, "Family should help family." The irony of those words pierced me deeper than any blade. Inside, I was torn apart. My blood begged me to save him, but my dignity screamed louder, reminding me of nights spent hungry, of days spent discarded, while he prospered on the ruin of my life. Was forgiveness strength or weakness? I looked into his desperate eyes, and with a voice steadier than I felt, I told him, "Face the truth yourself." He froze, then turned away. The door closed softly behind him, but the echo of his footsteps felt endless. My heart trembled, torn between love and survival. wondering if I had just saved myself or lost my son forever. The snow outside that December night fell gently, as though the world itself wanted to hush the noise of my past and lay it under a white blanket of silence. I sat at a small wooden table, the kind you might overlook in any modest home, yet to me it glowed with the warmth of belonging. Around me were the people who had stood beside me when I had nothing, the lawyer who'd offered me hope with words instead of pity, the shop workers who shared bread and laughter after long shifts, and the neighbors who treated me not as a man discarded, but as one worth welcoming. A roasted chicken sat at the center of the table, humble yet rich with meaning. There was no extravagance, no gold-plated cutlery or fine wine, but every bite carried the taste of loyalty and compassion. I looked around at their faces, lit by the glow of a single candle, and realized something that years of suffering had been trying to teach me. My worth did not depend on the approval of the son who turned me away, nor on the inheritance stripped from my hands. It lived here, in the company of those who chose me, who saw me, who stayed. The wounds of betrayal had not fully healed. Some scars still burned when I remembered the sound of my own blood shutting the door on me. But for the first time, those wounds felt like they belonged to an old life, one I no longer needed to chase or grieve. Peace had settled in my chest, quiet and steady, like the rhythm of a heart that had finally learned how to forgive, not for them, but for me. As the night deepened, we raised our glasses, some filled with cider, some with water, and someone joked, "To family." I caught my breath, because for the first time in years, the word didn't feel like a wound. It felt like home, and so I leave you with this truth, one carved out of sorrow, resilience, and renewal. Family isn't always who you're born to. It's who stands beside you when you have nothing, who shares your burdens without asking what they'll gain. Blood may betray, but love chosen freely, will never abandon you. That night I finally belonged. And that was more than enough.